The ram had gone over the cliff edge and hung there by one snared horn above a 40-foot drop, screaming the way only a dying animal screams, and every man on the Holloway ranch stood back from the crumbling rim with his hat in his hand, already counting the loss. Every man except her. Tabitha Fry went down on her belly in the wet shale and reached past the edge with both arms. Broad through the shoulder and heavy through the hip, a woman the whole of Burnt Fork had looked at on the depot platform that morning and decided was good for nothing but taking up a seat and a half on the coach. But she had a grip in those two hands that had wrung the necks of geese and twisted the wire of 1,000 fences. And she got one fist around that animal's hind leg and the other knotted in its greasy wool, and she hauled 190 pounds of panicked mountain ram straight up over the lip of a cliff that 3 grown men had been afraid to lean over. She did not stop hauling until the creature was standing on solid ground, trembling, alive. And she was sitting in the mud with her sleeves torn to the elbow and her heart going like a hammer. The men just looked at her. Not one of them had moved. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the very last word, and drop the name of the city you're watching from down in the comments below, because I want to see just how far Tabitha's story travels tonight. She had come to Burnt Fork, Wyoming, with one carpet bag, a wooden carding comb that had been her grandmother's, and a square of newspaper folded so many times the creases had worn through to little windows of nothing. She had read that square of paper on every leg of the 4-day journey west, in the lamplight of 3 different waiting rooms, until she did not need to read it anymore because she had it whole inside her head. A sheep ranch on the Burnt Fork Road, the notice said, wanted a woman of capable hands and steady habits for winter work, carding, spinning, the dressing of fleece, household help as the season required. Room and board provided, no prior references needed. It was that last line that had carried her 1,100 miles, because Tabitha Fry had no references in all the world to give. She had no family left who would put a good word on her, no former mistress who recalled her name with any warmth, no church back home that had not been quietly relieved to see the back of her. What she had was 2 strong arms, a back that had carried other people's burdens since she was 9 years old, and a knowledge of wool so deep and so particular that she could tell you, blindfolded, the difference between a fleece washed in hard water and one washed in soft, just by the way it whispered between her fingers. That knowledge was the one thing in the world that nobody could take from her, and the one thing nobody had ever thought to ask her for. Until the notice. Until the man on the Burnt Fork Road who needed exactly the thing she happened to be. The coach had let her down in front of the Burnt Fork Mercantile a little after noon, and she had stood on the boards with her bag against her knee and felt the town look at her. She knew that feeling the way a farmer knows weather coming. She had felt it her whole life, in church doorways and at supper tables and on the platforms of a dozen depots, the particular small silence that fell over a place when a woman of her size stepped into it. 2 old men on the mercantile bench had stopped their checkers to watch her. A woman in a good blue dress had pulled her little boy a half-step closer, as though largeness were a thing that might be catching. And somewhere off to her left a young cowhand had said, "Not quietly enough, Lord. They sent the whole flock and forgot the shepherd." And his friend had laughed. And Tabitha had set her jaw and looked at neither of them and asked the storekeeper, in a voice as level as a creek in August, the way out to the Holloway place. That was how she had come to be standing at the cliff edge an hour later when the ram went over. She had been walking the last 3 miles of the road on foot because no one had come to fetch her and she had not expected anyone would, and she had crested the rise just in time to see the trouble at the rim, the knot of men, the dust, the animal's hind legs scrabbling at nothing. She had not thought about it. She had set down her bag in the road and walked straight into the middle of those men and gone down on her belly in the shale before the foreman had even finished telling her, sharply, that this was no business for a passing woman to mix herself into. By the time he finished the sentence, the ram was up, and the woman he had been scolding was sitting in the mud, and the sentence had nowhere left to go. Now the men stood in a loose half-circle and stared, and the foreman, a lean, weathered man named Del Pruitt, with a face like a dried apple, pushed his hat back and said the only thing any of them had the wit to say, which was, well, just that. Well, and then, because a foreman has to be a foreman, you'll have torn your dress to ribbons. That's no way to come asking for work. I haven't come asking, Tabitha said, getting her feet under her and rising the way a big woman learns to rise, all of a piece and without apology. I've come because I was sent for. There's a difference, and a man who runs a ranch ought to know it. She picked a curl of wet wool off her sleeve and rubbed it between thumb and finger, automatic, the way another woman might worry a rosary. Cotswold cross, she thought. Long staple, gone coarse from a clip too late in the spring, and a fleece left too long on the animal's back. Neglected, the whole flock would be neglected if this ram was anything to judge by, and she felt something in her chest tighten and then, strangely, settle, because a neglected thing was a thing she understood, and a thing she could mend, and she had not been entirely sure, on the long road out, what she would do with herself if she arrived and found nothing here that needed her. Sent for, Del repeated. He looked her up and down, and there was no kindness in the look, but there was, she thought, the beginning of a grudging arithmetic. By Holloway. By the notice in the Cheyenne paper. Carting and spinning, winter work. I am the woman in the notice. She bent, slow against the pull of her own weight, and lifted her carpet bag out of the road. Now, if one of you would point me at the house, I'd be obliged. I've come a long way, and I'd as soon meet my employer before dark. A couple of the younger hands traded a look. The cowhand from the mercantile, a sandy-haired boy of maybe 19 named She Would Learn Pete, opened his mouth as if to say the thing he'd said in town, and Del Pruitt cut him off with a flat glance before a sound got out. That was the first thing Tabitha noted about the foreman that she would come to respect. He would not stop his own men from thinking a cruel thought. But he would not let them spend it out loud on his time. He jerked his chin for her to follow, and she followed, and the men fell in behind with the ram, and that was how Tabitha Fry came up the Holloway Road to the house for the first time. Mud to the elbows, a rescued animal at her back, and not one soul in the party yet aware that the ranch they were all walking toward was already as good as lost. The house, when it came into view at the top of the long rise, told her everything she needed to know in a single glance, the way a house always does to a woman who has spent her life reading the inside of other people's homes from the outside. It was a good house once. She could see that in the bones of it, a solid 2-story of squared logs and mill siding, a deep porch, a stone chimney at each gable end, built by someone who had meant to stay. But the paint had gone gray and was peeling in long curls. One porch post had been propped with a fence rail instead of replaced, and 3 windows on the upper floor had their curtains drawn in the middle of a bright afternoon. Rooms no longer used, shut up and gone cold. A house closed itself up room by room the way a man did, she thought, from the top down and the inside out. You could always tell. Beyond the house, the land rolled away gold and gray toward a line of low mountains gone blue with distance. And the land, at least, was beautiful, even tired as it was. The sheep were scattered across the near pasture in dirty cream-colored knots, more than she had expected, 400 or 500 head at a guess, and her hands itched at the sight of all that wool walking around in the cold with no one, by the look of it, tending it as it ought to be tended. There was a long, low shed to the east that would be the wool room, a barn, a bunkhouse with smoke at its pipe, a windmill turning lazy over a stock tank, and the whole of it had the look of a place where a great deal of work was being done, and none of it was getting ahead. She knew that look, too. It was the look of a household running downhill with a brake on, every hand pulling hard, and the whole thing sliding anyway. Del Pruitt left her at the foot of the porch steps. "He'll be inside," the foreman said. "Or he won't. He keeps his own hours." And then, gruffly, as close to a kindness as he was going to come, "There's a pump round the side if you want the worst of that mud off before he sees you." And he touched his hat brim, not quite respect, but not nothing, and walked away toward the shed with the men, leaving her alone in the yard with her bag and the long shadows reaching across the grass. She took his advice about the pump. She washed her hands and her forearms in the cold iron-tasting water and scrubbed the worst of the shale off her skirt, and she pinned a loose strand of hair back into place, and then she climbed the porch steps, which gave under her weight with a sound like a sigh. And she knocked on the door of the house she did not yet know she would spend the rest of her long life in. For a while nothing answered. She knocked again, and then the door opened, and she got her first look at Silas Holloway, and her first thought she would be ashamed of it later, because it was the same kind of quick, wrong measuring that the whole world had spent its life doing to her. Her first thought was that this was a man who had stopped. He filled the doorway, tall and lean and unsmiling, perhaps 35, with a dark beard going early to gray at the chin and eyes the flat brown of creek stones. He was not unhandsome. He might have been a striking man once, before whatever had happened to him happened. But there was a stillness in him that was not peace, a held quality, like a clock with the pendulum stopped at the bottom of its swing, and he looked at her on his porch with no surprise and no welcome and no anything at all, and he said, "You're the wool woman, Tabitha Fry." She did not offer her hand, because something in his stance told her he would not take it. And she had learned long ago to save herself that particular small humiliation before it was handed to her. You posted a notice. Carding. Spinning. The dressing of fleece. I've come to do it. His eyes went over her once, the way the whole town's eyes had gone over her that morning, and she stood and let him look because there was nothing else to do. And she watched his face for the thing she had seen on 100 faces, the recalculation, the flicker of the men who'd answered the notice, imagining some smaller, neater woman and getting her instead. She saw it cross his face. She did not see it stay. Whatever Silas Holloway had imagined when he wrote out that notice, he was too tired or too far gone in his own trouble to spend much on being disappointed by what had shown up, and that, she would think later, was the first small mercy this place had ever shown her. He was simply too sunk in his own losses to have any contempt left over to spare for hers. You came alone, he said. It was not quite a question. I did. From where? Ohio. Last, before that, a good many places. She lifted her chin a little. I have no references, Mr. Holloway, and the notice said none were needed, so I'll save us both the trouble of pretending. What I have is 22 years of wool. I was raised to it. I know carding, I know combing, I know spinning, worsted and woolen both. I know dyeing with what grows on the ground and what you buy in a tin. I can sort a clip into grades that'll fetch you a fair price instead of the trash price a careless sorter gets. And I can do every other thing a house and a kitchen need doing besides. I am not what you pictured. I am better than what you pictured. You'll know which inside of a week. She said it flat and plain, without heat, the way you'd state the weather, because she had learned that the only answer to being underestimated was to be undeniable, and she had nothing in the world left to be but undeniable. Something moved behind his stone-colored eyes. Not warmth. It was too soon, and he was too closed for warmth. But something. A man at the bottom of a well does not warm to the sight of a rope, exactly, but he looks at it. There's a flock of 490 head out there going into winter, Silas said with a clip on their backs, that's worth nothing to me, because the last buyer through here told me to my face it was worth nothing to him. Sorted bad, stored worse, half of it ruined with grease and dung and dirt before it ever left this place. I owe the bank in Cheyenne a note that comes due the 1st of March, and the only thing on this ranch that can pay it is wool, and the wool's no good. He said all of this in the flat, exhausted voice of a man reciting a thing he had said to himself so many times in the dark that it had stopped having any power to hurt him, which is a particular kind of despair, the kind that has gone quiet. So you tell me, wool woman, you that knows carding and combing and grades and prices, you think you can turn no good wool into bank money before the 1st of March? And Tabitha Fry, who had hauled a ram up a cliff that very afternoon, who had crossed 1,100 miles on a folded square of newspaper, who had been called too much of everything her whole life, and had decided somewhere along the way to simply be exactly as much as she was. Looked past Silas Holloway's shoulder at the dim cold rooms of his shut-up house, and then out across the yard at his dirty walking gold of a flock, and she felt the whole shape of the next 5 months settle onto her shoulders like a yoke she had been built her whole life to carry. Yes, she said, I can. Show me the wool room. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the door, not inviting her in exactly, but no longer barring the way, and he said, It'll keep till morning. You'll want to eat, and you'll want a bed. And he turned and walked back into the dim of the house, leaving the door open behind him, which was as much of an invitation as Silas Holloway had given anyone in a long time, though she did not know that yet either. She picked up her bag, and she stepped over the threshold into the cold front hall of the Holloway house, and the door swung shut behind her on the gold evening, and that was the beginning of it. The house was colder inside than out, with the particular damp chill of rooms where no fire is laid, because there is no one left who cares to be warm. She followed the sound of him down a dark hall, past a parlor where the furniture stood under dust sheets like a roomful of ghosts, and into a kitchen at the back that was the only living room in the whole place, a stove with a banked fire, a long scrubbed table, a window over the dry sink looking out at the darkening pasture. And it was there, in the kitchen doorway, that she got her second surprise of the day, because sitting at that long table with a slate and a stub of chalk watching her come in with the enormous, unguarded eyes of a child who does not yet know it is supposed to look away, was a little girl. She was perhaps 7, dark-haired like her father, thin as a fence wire, in a dress that had been let down at the hem twice and was still too short, and she had the chalk frozen in her hand and her whole small face turned up to the doorway, taking in the size and the strangeness and the torn-sleeved, mudded reality of Tabitha Fry with a frank astonishment that had not 1 ounce of cruelty in it, only wonder. Tabitha had spent her life being looked at. She knew every flavor of that look, and she knew within half a second that this one was different, that this was the look of a lonely child who has been starved of new faces and is simply helplessly glad of one, and something in Tabitha's chest that had been braced hard all day came quietly loose. "This is my daughter," Silas said, from over by the stove, and his voice when he said it changed, not softened exactly, but lowered, gentled, the way a man's voice does for the one thing in the world he has left to be careful of. Nan, this is Mrs. Fry. She's come to help with the wool." "Miss," Tabitha corrected gently. But Tabitha will do. She set her bag down by the door and crossed the kitchen, and she did not bend down over the child the way grown people do, looming, but pulled out the chair across the table and lowered herself into it so that her eyes and the girl's eyes were level, and she looked at the slate. "What are you working at there?" "Sums," said Nan, in a whisper, still staring. And then, because she was 7 and could no more hold the question in than she could fly, "Are you the strongest lady in the world?" Behind her, by the stove, Tabitha heard Silas Holloway make a small, rough sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the ghost of where a laugh would go in a man who had forgotten how, the way the foundation of a burned house still shows you the rooms. But it was something, and Tabitha filed it away the way she filed away the staple length of a fleece, a small fact about this place stored against the work to come. "I don't know about the world," she told the child, grave and honest, because children deserve honest answers and so seldom get them. "But I'm likely the strongest lady you've met. I pulled a ram up off a cliff this afternoon. Ask the men, they'll tell you, though they'll be sour about it." She picked up the slate and turned it toward herself and looked at the row of wobbling sums, 2 of them wrong, and she did not say they were wrong. She said, "You've got a good, clean hand at your numbers. Show me how you did this one," and she put the chalk back in the child's fingers, and Nan Holloway, who had not had a grown woman sit down at her level and ask to be shown a thing in longer than she could rightly remember, bent over her slate and began in a rush to show her. And that, though none of the 3 of them in that cold kitchen could have known it, was the moment the Holloway Ranch began, very slowly, by an inch a day across a long, hard winter, to come back to life. But I am getting ahead of myself, and a winter is a long thing, and you should know how cold it was before it turned warm, because the turning is the whole of the tale. There was a supper that first night, a thin one, salt pork and a heel of bread and coffee, the food of a house where no one had the heart to cook, and Tabitha ate it without comment and noted, silently. The bare pantry shelves and the sour smell of a kitchen run by a man and a child and nobody to mind it, and added that to the great ledger of need she was building in her head. There was a narrow, cold room off the back hall that was to be hers, with an iron bedstead and a window that didn't quite shut, and Silas Holloway said good night to her in a voice that gave nothing, and took his daughter up the dark stairs to bed. And Tabitha Fry sat alone on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in a cold house 1,100 miles from anywhere she had ever been, and she did not cry, because she had given up crying as a poor use of water some years back, but she sat very still a while in the candlelight and let the largeness of what she had taken on settle over her. 5 months, a flock nearly 500 strong, a clip ruined, and a buyer who'd walked, a banknote coming due the 1st of March, and the whole place balanced on it. A man shut up like a fall house, and a little girl going hungry for attention at the bottom of his grief. And one woman to mend all of it, a woman the town had laughed at on the platform that very morning. She thought about the laugh, the cowhand and his lord. They sent the whole flock and forgot the shepherd. And she found that the old hot shame it would once have lit in her had cooled over the years and the miles into a kind of patience, into the long, slow certainty of a woman underestimated so many thousands of times that she had come to think of it as a head start. Let them laugh. Wool did not care what a body looked like, and the bank did not care, and the 1st of March did not care. The 1st of March cared only about the work. And the work, the Lord knew, she could do. She blew out the candle and lay down in the cold, narrow bed, and somewhere out past the thin window a coyote called, and the windmill creaked, and 490 sheep stood out in the dark with a fortune of ruined wool on their backs. And Tabitha Fry closed her eyes and began, the way she always began a great task, by breaking it into the smallest possible first piece. Tomorrow she would not save the ranch. Tomorrow she would only walk into the wool room and find out exactly how bad the bad was. You could not mend a thing until you knew its true measure, and she had spent her whole life learning the true measure of things the world preferred to look away from. She would start there. She would start, as she had started everything, with her 2 hands and the truth. Morning came hard and bright and cold, frost silvering the grass, and her breath hanging in the air of the little back room, and Tabitha was up before the light with her sleeves already rolled, and she had the stove roaring and a pot of real oats going and a pan of biscuits in before Silas Holloway came down and stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at the warmth and the smell of it like a man who has walked into the wrong house. She put a plate in front of him without a word, and he ate like a man who had forgotten food could be a thing you looked forward to, slowly at first, and then not slowly. And when the little girl came down rubbing her eyes and found a real breakfast on the table, she looked up at Tabitha with such naked astonishment that Tabitha had to turn back to the stove a moment and busy her hands. "You didn't have to do all this," Silas said, when his plate was clean. There was something almost like an accusation in it. The discomfort of a man who has gotten used to deserving nothing and does not know where to put a kindness. "I cook breakfast for the people whose roof I'm under," Tabitha said simply, scraping the pan. "It isn't charity, and it isn't owed. It's just how a house ought to run." Now, she set down the pan and dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him, and her voice changed, went brisk and level and businesslike, the voice of a woman ready to begin. "You said you'd show me the wool room. I've waited till after breakfast like a Christian. Show me the wool, Mr. Holloway. Show me the worst of it. I want to see exactly what we're standing in before I tell you how we get out." He looked at her across the warm kitchen for a long moment. This enormous, capable mud and frost stranger who had hauled a ram off a cliff and cooked his child a breakfast and was now ordering him in his own house toward the very ruin he had been avoiding for a month. And whatever he saw in her face, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of any doubt, seemed to decide something small in him. He stood up from the table, He took his hat off the peg by the door. "All right, wool woman," he said. "Come and see." The wool room ran the length of the long, low shed east of the barn, and Tabitha smelled it before she saw it, which told her half the story before Silas ever swung the door. A good wool room smells of lanolin and dust and a clean animal sweetness of fleece. This one smelled of all that, and under it, sour, the smell of damp wool stored where the wet could get at it. And that one breath in the cold doorway confirmed every fear she had brought up the hill with her. They had thrown the fleeces into the bins loose and unrolled, the good wool and the breech and the stained tags and the dung locks all jumbled in together, fine and coarse and ruined in one bin, so that a buyer reaching in would pull up his best and his worst, tangled past separating, and price the whole lot at the worst. There was a stack near the wall gone dark with damp where the roof had let the autumn rain through, half rotted, good now for nothing but felt. And over all of it lay a fine pale grit of dust and dried mud because the windows had been left broken and the whole flock's worth of one careless year had drifted down onto the clip like snow. "Well," said Silas behind her in the flat voice, "there it is. That's what the buyer turned his nose up at, told me it cost him more to sort it than it was worth, and rode off. You see now why I asked could you make bank money out of no good wool. There was no hope in how he said it. He had brought her here, she understood, not because he believed she could do anything, but because some hard, honest part of him needed her to see the truth before she made him any promises, so that when she failed, and he plainly expected her to fail, at least she would have failed knowing. Tabitha did not answer him. She walked into the wool room and dug her fingers down past the foul top layer of the first bin, down to where the fleece had been protected by its own bulk, and she drew up a double handful and opened it out across her two palms in the gray window light. And there, under the grit and the bad storage, under a year of neglect, was the wool itself. She watched the crimp spring back, tight and even and bright, and she gave it the small, sharp tug that tells a wool woman everything, and the staple held, sound and strong. She put it to her cheek the way her grandmother had taught her, and it was soft, far softer than the coarse old ram out on the cliff had any right to promise. Good blood somewhere in this flock. Good wool, true wool, buried alive under ignorance, exactly the way she herself had spent her whole life buried. The good of her packed down out of sight under the one thing the world bothered to look at. Something fierce and glad rose up in her chest, standing there with a handful of treasure that no one but her had thought to dig for. "Mr. Holloway," she said, and she turned around with the wool open across her palms, and for the first time since she had stepped off the coach there was something burning low and steady in her voice. "Your buyer was a fool, or a thief, or a lazy man, and I'd lay money he was all three. This isn't no good wool. This is good wool sorted by people who didn't care. It wants sorting honest, every fleece by itself, the good kept from the bad so the bad can't drag the price of the good down with it. 5 months of hard particular work, and your leave to do it my way." She closed her hands gently around the wool. "Give me that, and I will not just pay your March note. I will get you a price that buyer never dreamed of. That's not a boast. That's wool. I know wool the way you know your own name, and this wool is telling me the truth, and I am telling it to you." For a long moment, Silas Holloway said nothing. He stood in the door of his own ruined wool room and looked at the enormous woman in the gray light, holding a handful of his despised clip out toward him like an offering, And something happened in his stone-colored face that had not happened there in a long time. A hairline crack. The first thin fracture in a wall mortared shut by a year of losing. He did not smile. But he came across the room, slow, and took a thread of the wool from her palm and rolled it between his own rough fingers and watched the crimp spring back, and Tabitha watched him recognize the truth of what she was holding. And that was where it began, though neither of them said another word, and he only put his hat back on and went out into the bright cold morning toward the flock, and left her there alone in the wool room with the work. Tabitha Fry stood among the bins a moment longer, in the dust-pale light, holding the good wool the whole world had thrown away. Then she rolled her sleeves up another turn, found a clear stretch of the long sorting table, and pulled the first fleece toward her to begin. The sorting took her the better part of 3 weeks, and she did it the way her grandmother had done it before her and her grandmother's mother before that, one fleece at a time. No shortcuts, no lumping, no mercy for the bad, and no contempt for it either. Only the honest separating of one kind of wool from another. She found an old door laid flat across 2 sawhorses and made it her skirting table, and over it she shook out each fleece cut side down the way it had come off the sheep, and she walked around it, reading it like a page. The fine across the shoulders and the side, that went one way. The coarser breech off the back legs went another. The stained tags and the dung locks and the second cuts went into their own sacks to be sold cheap and honest as exactly what they were, because the whole crooked trick of the trade was to hide the bad inside the good and price them as one, and Tabitha Fry would die before she sold a man a lie wrapped in a fleece. She graded as she went, fine and medium and low, and she tied each grade into its own sheet, and she chalked the bins, and slowly, fleece by fleece, the long room that had smelled of damp and despair began to smell of order and lanolin and clean work. She did not do it alone for long. On the second morning, a boy came and stood in the wool room door. 15, maybe, all elbows and Adam's apple, with a smart set to his mouth that said he had decided in advance this was going to be funny. Pete, the youngest of the hands, sent down by the foreman to see was there anything the new woman wanted carried. He looked at the sorting table and the chalked bins, and at Tabitha with her sleeves rolled past the elbow and her forearms dusted gray, and he said, with all the easy cruelty of a boy showing off to men who weren't even there to watch, they really did send the whole flock and forget the shepherd, didn't they? You sure you can find your way around all that wool, ma'am? It's an awful lot of wool for one, and he let it hang, the way they always let it hang, expecting her to flinch. Tabitha did not flinch. She had been 15-year-old boy's favorite joke for 30 years, and she had long since stopped bleeding from it. She picked up a fleece, shook it out across the table, and without even looking up, she said, "You see that crimp? How tight it springs? Come here." And something in the flat command of it, the sheer unbothered authority, pulled the boy 3 steps into the room before he remembered he'd meant to be smart. Put your finger on it. Now pull, gentle. Feel how it holds and doesn't break? That's a sound staple. That's money. The dark stack by the wall, the wet stuff, pull on that, and it'll snap like rotten thread. That's not money, that's a lesson about fixing your roof. Now she straightened up to her full height, which was considerable, and looked down at him, not unkindly. You can stand in my door and practice your jokes on me, and I'll have heard worse from better, or you can learn to grade wool from the only person on this ranch who knows how, and be worth $3 more a day by lambing. Your pick. I've got work. Pete picked the wool. Boys that age always picked the wool. In the end, if you offered it to them straight instead of slapping them down, Tabitha had learned that long ago, too. By the end of the week, the smart mouth had gone quiet and the hands had gone busy, and Pete could tell fine from medium with his eyes shut and had started, without quite meaning to call her ma'am in a different voice than he'd started with. He carried the tied fleeces, and he hauled the bad stack out, and he stood the broken windows up with fresh-cut boards and oiled paper, and when the other hands ribbed him for fetching and carrying for the wool woman, he told them, with the fierce loyalty of the newly converted, that she knew more about the thing that paid all their wages than the lot of them put together, which was nothing but the truth. While the wool came right, so did the house. Tabitha did it in the margins of the day, in the gray hour before the men were up, and the gray hour after the child was asleep, because she could not abide the slow closing up of a good house any more than she could abide good wool left to rot. Room by room, she opened the place back up. She took the sheets off the front room furniture and beat the dust out of them in the cold yard. She scoured the pantry and found, behind the near-empty front shelves, a deep larder a careful woman had once stocked and a careless year had let run down, and she set it right, put up what could be put up, made a list of what was wanted, learned the bottom of every barrel. She blacked the stove till it shone, and she scrubbed the long neglected floors on her knees with sand and lye till the boards came back pale and honest under the grime, and she mended the curtains, and she got the parlor clock going again, a thing that had stood silent so long that when it ticked the little girl came running to see what the sound was. The house had been holding its breath for a year, shutting its own doors one by one the way a grieving man shuts his, and Tabitha Fry went through it like a thaw, opening what had been closed, warming what had gone cold, until light came back into rooms that had forgotten it, and in the middle of all of it, like a small, wary cat that wanted to be near the fire but did not yet trust the hand, there was Nan. The child had taken to following her, not openly, not at first. At first it was only that wherever Tabitha was working, there Nan somehow happened to be, a small, silent presence in a doorway, watching with those grave 7-year-old eyes that had seen a mother go into the ground and a father go into himself in the same hard year. Tabitha did not chase her and did not coax her. She had spent her life around skittish things, and she knew you did not reach for them. You simply went on being warm and steady and let them come to the warmth in their own time. So she let the child watch. And then one afternoon, sorting at the long table, she said into the air, not turning around, "If a person were going to be useful, that person could hand me the chalk by your foot." And after a moment a small hand put the chalk into her big one, and that was the beginning. After that, Nan was always there. Tabitha taught her to tell the grades. Fine for a dress against your skin, she said. Medium for a good warm coat, low for the rugs you wipe your boots on, and every one of them honest work and worth its honest price. There's no shame in any wool that's sold for true what it is. She taught the child to card with the worn maple calm that had come 1,100 miles in the bottom of her carpet-bag, her grandmother's comb. And she put her own big hands over the small ones to set the rhythm of it. And the two of them sat in the warming wool room in the lamplight and carded, and the child's tongue, which had been so locked up with grief, began little by little to come loose. She told Tabitha about her mother in pieces, sideways, the way children tell the unbearable things, how Mama had sung when she churned, how Mama's hair had smelled, how nobody sang any more. Tabitha listened to all of it and judged none of it, and answered the child's terrible plain questions with terrible plain truth, because she had learned the hard way that what children cannot bear is not grief, but being lied to about grief. One evening she noticed the child tugging at the hem of her dress, the way a child does when the dress has gone too short and nobody has had the heart or the eye to notice. And Tabitha noticed and said nothing about it, and that night after Nan was abed, she took the dress and a good length from her own work apron and let the hem down, and pieced it true, and added a band of clean blue at the bottom that turned the shame of an outgrown dress into something that looked almost on purpose, almost chosen. And when Nan came down in the morning and saw what had been done to her dress in the night, saw that someone had looked, had seen, had cared enough to mend, she stood very still on the bottom stair. And then she crossed the kitchen at a dead run and threw both arms around as much of Tabitha's middle as a 7-year-old could reach, and held on and would not let go, her face pressed into the apron. Saying nothing at all, Tabitha stood with the child clamped to her like a burr, and put one big, careful hand on the small, dark head, and her own throat closed up tight, because she had been so many things to so many ranches over the long years, strong, useful, paid, dismissed, and she had never once in all that time been the thing a child ran to. She had to look hard at the window a moment and study herself before she could trust her voice. "There now," she said at last, rough with it. "There now. It's only a dress." But it was not only a dress, and they both knew it, and across the kitchen in the doorway Silas Holloway come in unheard with the cold still on his coat. Stood and watched his daughter hold on to the wool woman as if to keep from drowning, watched something his child had not done since the spring her mother died, and his stone face did a thing Tabitha did not see, because her back was to him. But the child saw. Nan looked over and saw her father standing there, and for one held breath father and daughter looked at each other across the warm kitchen over the head of the woman between them. And then Silas turned without a word and went back out into the cold, and the door shut behind him. Gentle, not slammed. A closed door still. But Tabitha, when she finally turned and saw he had been and gone, looked a long moment at that quietly shut door, and thought that for a man who'd let his whole house go silent, he had at least been careful, this time, not to slam it. That was the shape of those first weeks, the wool coming right under her hands, the house warming room by room, the child thawing like ground in March, and the man. The man staying shut, watching from doorways, taking his warm breakfast every morning with that same baffled discomfort, saying his few flat words and going out to his flock. He gave her her leave and her free hand, and he did not interfere. Whatever the wool had told him that first morning, he was trusting it, even if he would not yet trust her. And Tabitha, who had not come 1,100 miles for a man's good opinion and told herself firmly she did not want it, found herself none the less listening for his boot on the step of an evening, and was annoyed with herself for it, and went on listening anyway. The work was not all kitchens and carting. She earned her place in harder coin, too, the way she had always earned it, by being the one who knew what to do when a thing went wrong. There came a morning when one of the hands, Tomlin, brought word that a ewe was down in the near pasture, bloated and groaning and going fast. And the men stood around her in that helpless circle men make around a dying animal they've already given up on. Tabitha came across the frozen field at a heavy run, dropped to her knees in the mud beside the ewe, and had the situation read in a glance, bloat, the gas building deadly fast, minutes left. She'd seen it 100 times on 100 ranches. She sent Pete flying for the things she named, and she worked over that U with her sleeves shoved up and her arms freezing, calm and fast and sure, doing the rough plain doctoring the case wanted, and the men watched the new woman save a life their own hands had been ready to write off. When the U heaved and struggled up onto her trembling legs and lived, Tomlin took his hat off, which on a working ranch in the cold is no small church. Where'd a wool woman learn doctoring like that? He asked, and Tabitha, scraping mud off her arm, said, same place a wool woman learns everything. By being the only one left to do it. And one by one, that winter, the hands came over to her. Not all at once, and not with speeches, but the way working men come to respect a person, by watching what the person can actually do. The foreman came over soonest and stayed firmest. Del Pruitt was a leather-faced old hand who had done the arithmetic on her the very first day out by the cliff, while the dust was still settling off the rescued ram, had looked at what those shoulders and those hips and those plain, capable hands had just done and decided, against every prejudice of his time and place, that he was a fool who'd back ability over appearance any day a man was smart enough to know the difference. Del had no use for the town's joke. He'd buried 2 wives and ranched 40 years, and he knew exactly what a thing was worth regardless of its wrapper, and what this woman was worth he had seen with his own eyes inside her first hour on the hill. He made himself her open ally in front of the hands, deliberately the way a foreman does when he means to set the tone for the rest, deferred to her on the wool. Took her side in the small daily frictions, called her Miss Fry in a voice that dared anyone to make it a joke. And it was Del, more than anyone, who started to let her see the true shape of the trouble the Holloway Ranch was in, because Del had been carrying that shape alone in the dark for a year and was bone-tired of carrying it. It started with the ledger. Tabitha had asked for the ranch books, not to pry, she said, but because you could not get a place out of a hole until you knew exactly how deep the hole was and exactly who had been digging it, and Silas, after a silence, had handed them over, another small closed door easing open. She took them to the kitchen table at night by the lamp and went through them the way she went through everything, slow and honest and missing nothing, and what she found made her sit very still. The numbers told a year of bad luck, yes, the dead clip, the buyer who walked, the banknote, but underneath the bad luck, when she ran the columns back 3 and 4 years, she began to find a pattern that was not luck at all. The Holloway wool had been selling low for years. Not catastrophe low like this last ruined clip, but quietly, steadily low. A fine blood flox fleece priced year after year as if it were common range wool. Always to the same buyer, always graded down at the weigh-in, always a little less than it should have fetched. A few dollars here, a few there, a thumb on the scale so light that a grieving, overworked man running a ranch on his own would never catch it. But Tabitha Fry was not a grieving, overworked man. Tabitha Fry knew wool the way she knew her own name, and she sat at that kitchen table with 3 years of stolen dollars laid out under her finger, and felt the cold certainty settle into her that the Holloways had not merely had bad luck. The Holloways had been farmed. Somebody had been quietly, patiently bleeding this ranch for years. And the ruined clip and the walked-away buyer were not the start of the trouble. They were the harvest of it. She took it to Del first, before she took it to Silas, because she wanted to be sure, and because she had a feeling the old foreman already knew something he hadn't been able to prove. She laid the books open on a feed barrel in the lamplit barn and put her finger on the column and said, "Dell, this wool's been selling under its grade for years. Same buyer every time. Tell me I'm reading it wrong." And the old man looked at where her finger lay and was quiet a long time. And then he said, "Lo, you're not reading it wrong, Miss Fry. I've felt it in my gut 3 years running and never had the eyes to prove it on paper. That buyer, the one walked off on the clip, he don't buy for himself. Never has." Dell looked toward the dark door of the barn and lowered his voice still further. The voice of a man saying out loud at last a thing he has only let himself think. He buys for Asa Creel. The name meant nothing to Tabitha then, but the way the old man said it, the weight he put on it, the glance at the door, told her it would come to mean a great deal. And over the next hour, in the lamplight, with the stock shifting in their stalls, Dell Pruitt told her about Asa Creel. And she began at last to see the whole true shape of the thing she had walked into. Creel was the biggest wool grower in the county and meant to be the only one. He ran his flocks on the long benchland to the south and the west, thousands of head, and he had spent 20 years swallowing the small outfits around him one by one. Not with guns. The county was past the gun by now. But with patience and money and the slow, steady squeeze, which Dell said was worse, because you could shoot back at a gun. Creel's way was quieter. A neighbor's wool would start grading low at the regional sale, always to Creel's buyer. Year on year, the price bled down a little at a time. Then a hard season would come, as hard seasons always came. And the squeezed-down outfit would have no cushion left to ride it out, and the note at the bank would come due with no clip money to cover it, and then, just then, kind as a deacon, Asa Creel would ride up the lane and offer to buy the place. Cheap, but in cash, and in time to save the family from the shame of the bank taking it. And the broken neighbor, with the note due and the buyer gone and the children to feed, would sign. And Creel's benchland would grow by another quarter, and his flock by another few hundred head, and there would be one fewer free outfit on the hill. "And now," said Dell heavily, "it's our turn. He's wanted this hill 10 years. You want to know why? Walk the high pasture come spring and watch where the snowmelt runs. We sit on the best water on the whole north side. Miss Fry, 3 springs that never fail, even in a drought year, and Creel's benchland runs dry as a bone every August. He don't want our sheep, and he don't much want our grass. He wants our water. He's been bleeding the wool price down for years to soften us up, and this last go, getting his buyer to walk off the clip entire, leave us with no sale money at all, and that March note hanging, that wasn't bad luck either. That was the squeeze closing. He means to have the bank take this place if we can't pay, and then buy it off the bank for pennies and shut us off this hill for good." And Silas, the old foreman, stopped and rubbed his leather face and looked suddenly very tired. Silas knows something's wrong. He is not a stupid man. But he's grieving, and grief makes a man's eyes go dull, and he can't see the hand that's doing it. He just thinks the world's gone against him. He doesn't know it's got a name. Tabitha sat on the feed barrel with the lamplit ledger open on her knees and the cold barn breathing around her, and she felt the whole thing lock into place. The ruined clip, the walked buyer, the years of low prices, the note due the 1st of March, the best water on the north side of the county sitting under a flock too fine for the price it fetched. It was not bad luck. It was a man, and the man had a name, and the name was Asa Krale, and he meant to take this hill and this child's home and this whole warm house she had just spent 3 weeks opening room by room, and he meant to do it quietly, legally, with a kind smile and a cash offer, before the snow was off the high pasture. Something happened in Tabitha Fry then, sitting on that barrel in the dark. It was not anger exactly, or not only anger. It was the old deep certainty rising up in her, the same thing that had risen when she'd seen the good wool buried under the grit, the absolute refusal to let a worthy thing be thrown away by people too lazy or too crooked or too cruel to dig for its real value. She had spent her whole life being the buried worth thing, the good packed down out of sight under the one cheap thing the world bothered to weigh. And here was a whole ranch, a whole family, a fine blood flock and a thawing child and a shut-up grieving man, all of them about to be graded down and thrown out cheap by a man with his thumb on the scale. And Tabitha Fry, who knew exactly what it was to be undervalued by a thief, felt every undervalued year of her own life gather behind her like a wind. "Dell," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very level, the voice she used when she had stopped weighing a thing and started doing it. "Does Silas know what you just told me?" "About Crail, about the water, the whole of it. He knows pieces," the foreman said. "He doesn't know the shape. And I'll be honest with you, Miss Fry, I've not had the heart to draw it out plain for him. A man that low, you tell him the whole world's a trap closing on his child's home, and there's a rich man's hand on the lever, and I was afeard of what it'd do to him. So I've sat on it. God forgive me, I've sat on it, because I couldn't see what good the truth would do a man too broke to fight it." "The good the truth does," said Tabitha, closing the ledger and standing up off the barrel to her full considerable height, "is it tells you exactly where to push." She stood in the lamplight with the books under her arm and the cold around her, and the old foreman looked up at her. And later he would tell the hands that it was right about then that he first let himself believe, not hoped, believed that the Holloway place might not be lost after all. "Crail's been counting on this family being too small and too sad and too alone to fight back," she went on, half to herself now, already 3 moves ahead. Already laying out in her head the long, careful work it was going to take. A grieving man, a little girl, an old foreman, and a clip he's ruined. That's the arithmetic he's banking on. He doesn't know they've got a wool woman now. She almost smiled. He doesn't know the clip isn't ruined. He doesn't know I've been to the bottom of those bins and felt what's in them. He thinks he's bleeding common wool off a broke man. "Dell, that flock out there is fine blood, and graded honest, it'll fetch a price that'll make a liar of every number that thief's written in these books. He spent 10 years teaching this county that Holloway wool is cheap. I aim to teach them different, in one sale, in front of everyone, where he can't put his thumb on the scale because the whole regional floor'll be watching." The old man stared at her. "You can't grade your own clip at the regional sale, Miss Fry. Crail's man does the weighing. That's the whole trick of it. He grades you down, and there's not a soul on the floor knows enough about wool to call him a liar to his face." "There will be," said Tabitha Fry, "by March." And she tucked the ledger tighter under her arm and looked out the barn door into the cold dark toward the long, low shed where 500 fleeces lay sorted honest in their chalked bins, every grade kept clean and true by her own 2 hands. And she began standing there to build the thing in her mind piece by piece, the way she built every great task, not all at once, never all at once, but starting with the smallest first true piece. She would need an honest buyer, not Creole's man, a real one out of Cheyenne, somebody with a name and a conscience and no stake in this county's crooked games, somebody she could reach by mail before the roads got bad. She would need a show fleece, one perfect grade A clip rolled out with a whole sale floor could put their own hands on it and feel the truth, so that when Creole's buyer tried to call fine wool common, he'd be calling it common in front of 50 growers who just felt the crimp themselves. She would need the books, these books, the years of stolen dollars laid out plain. And she would need time, and weather, and luck, and the note not to come due one single day before she was ready. But the work she could do. The work she had been doing her whole life. And as she walked back across the frozen yard toward the warm, lit kitchen window with a ledger under her arm, Tabitha Fry was not afraid, or not mostly afraid. She was something she had not let herself be in a long time. She was glad, fierce and low and glad. Because for the first time since the depot platform and the laughter and the long, humiliating walk up the hill, she was not merely useful. She was needed. There was a thing here worth saving that no one else could save, and she was the one who could, and that was the only thing Tabitha Fry had ever truly wanted out of a life that had given her so little else, to be, just once, the hands the world could not do without. She did not know yet that Asa Creole had already noticed the wool room going quiet and orderly where it had been ruined. She did not know that a man who bleeds a county for 10 years keeps his ears open, and that word travels in wool country, word of a buyer walked off a clip, word of a big plain woman up at the Holloway place who'd hauled a ram off a cliff and was, they said, doing something strange in particular with that despised clip in the long shed east of the barn. She did not know that the squeeze, which had been so patient for so long, was about to feel a thing it had not felt in 10 years of swallowing small ranches whole, resistance, and that a man like Creole did not abide resistance, but moved to crush it early, before it could find its feet. She only knew the work, and the cold, and the warm window ahead of her, and the child asleep beyond it, and the man who took his breakfast in baffled silence, and did not yet know his ranch had a name for its enemy and a wool woman for its hope. She went in out of the cold and set the ledger on the table and banked the stove for the night. And up the dark long benchland to the south, behind a lamplit window of his own, a man she had not yet met was already beginning to wonder, with the first faint stirring of irritation, just exactly what was being done to that ruined clip up on the Holloway Hill, and whether this one time his patient 10-year arithmetic had left something out. The first week of February came in hard off the high country, and with it came the work in earnest, the long, careful building of the thing Tabitha had laid out for herself in the cold barn that night. She did it the way she did everything, without announcement, without asking leave, one small true piece at a time, so that a man watching from the outside would have seen only a big, plain woman going quietly about a ranch's ordinary chores, and would never have guessed that under the quiet she was assembling board by board. The lever that would move the whole crooked weight of Asa Creole off the Holloway Hill. She wrote the letter to Cheyenne first. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied, sitting at the kitchen table after Nan was asleep, the lamp turned low to save oil, her grandmother's carding comb set beside the inkwell the way another woman might keep a Bible by her for studiness. She had a name from Dell, a wool merchant out of the railhead at Cheyenne. A man called Edmund Hart, who bought for the Eastern mills and who had a reputation, Dell said, for paying honest and grading honester. The kind of buyer who had ridden out of the trade entirely rather than put his thumb on a scale. Tabitha did not beg in the letter. She had begged once in her life on a depot platform a long way east of here, and it had bought her nothing but a folded newspaper and a stranger's pity, and she had sworn off it. Instead, she wrote him the truth, plainly, the way one wool person writes to another. She told him there were 490 head of fine blood sheep on a ranch in Burnt Fork whose clip had been graded common for 10 years by a buyer with an interest in keeping it cheap. She told him she had been to the bottom of the bins with her own hands and that the wool was sound, fine, and fathered fine, Spanish blood 3 generations deep under the neglect, a crimp and a staple that any honest grader would weep to see thrown away at a robber's price. She told him she was preparing a show fleece for the regional sale at Two Forks the second week of March, and that she would stake her own name and her grandmother's comb on its grade, and that she invited him to come and put his own hands on it and call it what it truly was in front of the whole floor where no man's thumb could reach the scale. She signed it Tabitha Fry, Wool Woman, and under her name, after a long moment's thought. She wrote one more line. I am told you left the trade rather than weigh a thing false. I am asking you to come back for one sale and weigh a thing true. And then she sealed it, and the next morning she walked it the 4 miles down to the Burnt Fork post, rode herself in the cutting wind rather than trust it to anyone else's hands. And she stood and watched the mail rider take it east before she walked the 4 miles home, and she said nothing to anyone, not even Dell, because a thing not yet done is a thing that can still be broken, and Tabitha had learned long ago to keep her unfinished work behind her teeth. The show fleece was the harder thing and the slower. A grade A clip that would shame a thief in front of 50 growers could not be hunted up in an afternoon. It had to be found. One fleece among 500, the single best of all that buried gold. And then it had to be brought up to a perfection that left no quarrel in it. She went through the chalked bins one fleece at a time, in the cold of the long shed, her breath smoking. Her broad, capable hands opening each rolled fleece and reading it the way other people read print, the staple length, the fineness of the fiber, the evenness of the crimp running through it like the grain in good wood, the soundness with no break or tenderness from a hard winter or a sick season. She set the candidates aside on a clean board, a dozen, then 6, then 3. And she lived with the 3 for days, going back to them in the early dark and the late dark until one morning she knew the one. It came off a ewe Dell could name, a 4-year-old out of the old foundation blood, a fleece so fine and so sound and so beautifully even that Tabitha stood holding it in the cold shed with something close to reverence, because this exact thing in her 2 hands was the whole truth of the Holloway Ranch made visible. The buried worth that a thief had spent 10 years swearing did not exist. It was while she was kneeling over that fleece on the clean board, working a fault out of one shoulder of it with the patience of a woman threading a needle by failing light, that Silas Holloway came into the long shed and stood watching her. And something in the long, cold winter began, very quietly, to turn. He had not sought her out before. In 3 weeks of her opening his house room by room, of his daughter thawing under her hands like ground in spring, of his breakfast appearing hot and his ledger appearing balanced, and his ruined wool room appearing, against all reason, orderly and full of a strange new promise. In all of it, the man had stayed a closed door, transactional and cold. A widower stopped dead in his grief, paying her wage and giving her orders, and never once letting her see past the wall he had built around whatever was left of him inside. Tabitha had not pushed at the door. She knew about closed doors. She had spent her own life behind one. She had only gone on doing the work, warming the house around the cold man the way you warm a room around a person who cannot warm himself, asking nothing, waiting nothing, simply being present and useful and unfailingly kind, the way you are kind to a thing that has been hurt past speaking. But this evening he came into the shed, drawn by the lamplight, and he found her kneeling over the show fleece, and he did not give an order. He stood, and he watched her hands move, and after a long while he said, in a voice she had not heard him use before, quieter, with the cold gone thin in it, my wife used to say wool had a grain, like wood. I never knew what she meant. He looked at the fleece spread pale and perfect on the clean board between Tabitha's hands. I think I see it now. Tabitha did not look up at once, because she understood, with the deep and careful instinct of a person who has been around frightened things, that the man had just done a difficult and dangerous thing. He had opened the door a crack, and a crack was all it was, and if she turned and stared straight into it, he would slam it shut and bar it for good. So she went on working the fault out of the shoulder of the fleece, gently, her eyes on her hands, and she said, as easy and unremarkable as if they had talked like this every evening of their lives, she was right. It runs through good wool just the same, that crimps the grain of it. You can feel it with your eyes shut. Here, and she lifted the edge of the fleece toward him without looking up, an offering made small enough to refuse, and after a moment Silas Holloway crossed the cold shed and crouched down on his heels beside her in the lamplight and put his rough rancher's hand on the wool his dead wife had loved, and felt the grain of it under his fingers, and was quiet a long time. "Why?" he said at last, and stopped and started again, and Tabitha had the sense of a man hauling words up from the bottom of a well he had nailed shut years ago. "Why do you work like this? You came 1,100 miles to a ranch you had never seen, on a notice that promised you nothing, for a wage that's barely a wage. And you work?" He gestured at the orderly bins, the chalked grades, the perfect fleece, the warm house up the hill where his daughter slept clean and mended for the first time since her mother died. You work like the place is yours, like the child is yours, like there's something here worth the breaking of your back, when any fool with two eyes can see it's a ruined ranch and a broke man and a March note that's going to take the whole of it. He looked at her, and his cold gray eyes were not cold just then, only tired and lost and asking, "What do you see that I cannot?" And Tabitha Fry sat back on her heels in the lamplight with the show fleece between them, and she gave him the truest answer she had. Because the man had opened a door, and the only way to keep it open was to walk through it honest. "I see what's buried," she said. "I have spent my whole life being the buried thing, Mr. Holloway, the good packed down under the one cheap thing the world bothers to weigh. They looked at me on the depot platform the morning I came. You heard how they laughed. I know you heard. And every one of them weighed me by the one thing they could see, which was a big, plain woman, too broad in the shoulder and too heavy in the hip to be worth a second look. And not one of them dug an inch past it to find out there were 22 years of wool knowledge underneath, and a strong back, and a comb my grandmother put in my hands when I was 6. I know exactly what it is to be graded common by people too lazy to find the truth. She put her hand flat on the perfect fleece. And then I came up your hill, and I dug down past the foul top layer of those bins the way nobody had bothered to do in 10 years, and I found this. Fine blood wool, sound and true, the best I have handled in my life, buried under grit and neglect and a thief's low price. And I knew it the way you know your own face in a glass, because it was me. It was the exact same thing that's been done to me my whole life, done to a whole ranch full of innocent sheep and one good child and a man too sunk in his grief to dig. She looked up at him then, finally, full in the face. I work like the place is mine, Misty, Holloway, because I cannot stand by and watch a worthy thing thrown away cheap by people too crooked or too cruel or too tired to find out what it's truly worth. I have had that done to me too many times. I'd sooner break my back than watch it done to you. For a long moment the man only looked at her. Crouched there in the lamplight with the cold shed breathing around them and the perfect fleece between their two hands, and something moved behind his tired gray eyes, something that had been frozen a long time and was, against all his will, beginning to thaw. It was not a thing he had words for. He was a stopped man, a man who had nailed shut a door over the only room in himself worth living in. The day they put his wife in the ground, and he had not opened it since, not for his own child, not for the ranch dying around him, not for anything. But this big, plain woman with the stubby hands and the grandmother's comb had just reached straight through the boards of it without seeming to try, and he found, to his own bewilderment, that he did not want to nail it shut again. He wanted, and the wanting frightened him, after so long of wanting nothing, to keep it open one more minute, and hear her voice fill the cold shed one more time, and feel just at the edge of himself the strange, unaccustomed warmth of being seen by someone who did not flinch from what she saw. He opened his mouth. He did not know, even then, what he was going to say, but it was something. It was the first true thing he had let up out of that nailed room in 3 years, and Tabitha saw it coming and held very still the way you hold still for a wild thing that has finally come to your open hand. And the shed door banged open on the wind, and young Pete stood in it, white-faced and gasping, the cold pouring in around him, and the moment shattered like dropped glass. Mr. Holloway, Miss Fry, the stock tank. The boy could barely get the words out. He had run the whole way down from the north pasture in the dark. The big tank on the north side, it's run dry, every drop, the flocks milling and bawling for water, and there's not a cupful in it, and Dell sent me running, he says. He says it didn't run dry. Mr. Holloway, he says somebody opened the drain. There's boot marks in the mud, and the drain plugs pulled clean out and thrown in the brush, and 400 head with no water in a freeze, and Dell says, the boy swallowed, Dell says, you'd best come, and come now. Silas was on his feet before the boy finished, the open door in his face slamming shut again behind the rancher's mask, and Tabitha was up beside him with the show fleece forgotten on its board, and the cold certainty was already rising in her again, colder and surer than the wind, because a stock tank does not pull its own plug, and boot marks in the mud are a man's boot marks. And the squeeze that had been so patient for so long had just, for the first time, reached out its hand and touched them. It was Asa Crail's first move, and it had come, as Tabitha had half feared it would, the moment word reached him that the despised Holloway clip was being worked over careful and quiet by a wool woman who knew what she was doing. He had heard. Of course he had heard. A man who bleeds a county for 10 years keeps his ears open, and word travels in wool country, and the word that had reached the lamplit window up the south benchland was word of orderly bins and chalked grades, and a big plain woman doing something strange in particular with a clip Crail had spent a decade teaching the whole county to call cheap. A man like that does not abide resistance. He crushes it early, before it can find its feet. And so, on a freezing night in the first week of February, his man, and it was never Crail himself, it was always a man, that was the whole patient cowardice of the way he worked, had ridden quiet onto the north pasture and pulled the plug on 400 head of fine blood sheep and ridden quiet away, leaving boot marks in the mud as the only signature on a message that needed no words. I know what you are doing up there, and I can reach you, and I will bleed this ranch by inches until you break. What followed was the longest night Tabitha Fry had spent since she came to Burnt Fork, and the night the Holloway hands stopped thinking of her as the big, strange woman the master had hired and started, every one of them, to think of her as something else. There was no fixing the drain tank in the dark, and the freeze, the plug was lost, the brush too tangled to hunt it in lamplight. And 400 head needed water now, tonight, before the cold and the milling panic did what Crail's man had ridden away trusting it would do. It was Tabitha who saw the answer, standing at the empty tank with the bawling flock milling around her in the dark, her mind moving the way it moved over a tangle of fouled wool, past the panic, past the loss, straight to the one true piece you could lay your hands on, the spring. There was a spring-fed seep at the foot of the north draw Dale had shown her once, the original water before the tank was ever built, choked now and half forgotten, but living still under the ice. If they could open it and string the flock down to it in bunches through the night, drive them down 100 head at a time to drink and back up to the shelter of the lee fence, they could carry the whole 400 through till morning on the spring alone and lose not a single head, and hand Asa Crail's man back his message unopened. And so they did, the whole long, brutal, freezing night of it, Silas and Dell and Pete and the two other hands and Tabitha Fry, breaking the ice off the choked seep with a pick, and their bare, cold hands opening the old water foot by frozen foot, then driving the panicked flock down the draw in bunches in the dark, 100 bawling head at a time, holding them at the spring till they had drunk, and hazing them back up to the lee of the fence, then turning and going down for the next 100, and the next, and the next, hour after hour, while the cold tried to kill the sheep and the men and the woman all together, and did not, because Tabitha would not let it. She worked harder than any 2 men on that hill. She broke ice till her hands bled, and she did not stop. She carried a chilled lamb that had gone down in the cold inside her own coat against her own body to bring it back, and it came back. And somewhere in the black middle of that night, hazing the last bunch up out of the draw, with her broad shoulders set against the wind and her bleeding hands sure on the staff, she looked up and found Silas Holloway working beside her in the dark, the two of them moving the flock together without a word needing said, each one knowing where the other would be, and she understood that the door he had opened in the shed had not, this time, slammed all the way shut, that he was working beside her now not as a master beside a hired hand, but as a man beside the one person on. God's earth he had come, in 3 short weeks, to trust at his shoulder in the dark. Toward the gray of morning, with the last 100 head watered and turned back up to the leaf fence, and the whole 400 safe, and the killing night survived, and not one sheep lost, the hands stood together at the empty tank in the first cold light, all of them past speech with exhaustion. And Del Pruitt looked at the boot marks frozen now in the mud where Crale's man had pulled the plug, and then he looked at Tabitha Fry standing swaying on her feet with her bleeding hands and the chilled lamb still breathing inside her coat, and the old foreman took off his hat to her. He just took it off, there in the gray light, the way a man does at a thing he has decided to honor. And after a moment Pete did the same, and then the other two, and they stood bare-headed in the freezing dawn before the big plain woman the town had laughed at on the depot platform 3 weeks before, and not one of them was laughing now. "Boys," said Del Pruitt, in a voice rough with cold and something else, "I've been 40 years on this hill, and I want to say it where she can hear it. That clip ain't the only thing of worth on this ranch that got graded cheap by people too blind to dig. We had a wool woman come up our road, and we none of us knew what we'd got. I know now." He put his hat back on. "And I'll tell you something else I know. The man that pulled that plug last night, he was sending a message that we were too small and too sad and too alone to fight. And he sent it to the wrong ranch. Because we ain't alone anymore. We got Miss Fry." And Silas Holloway, standing a little apart in the gray dawn with the killing night behind him, and his ranch saved by a woman's wit and a woman's bleeding hands, looked at Tabitha across the frozen tank and did not say anything at all. But the look itself was a thing she would carry, because it was the look of a man whose nailed-shut door had been forced clean off its hinges in the dark, and who knew it now, and who was not, for the first time in 3 years, entirely sorry. There was no question after that night of what it was, the thing pulling at the Holloway Hill. Tabitha laid it out for Silas in the kitchen the next evening. Plain, the whole shape of it, Crale, the water, the 10-year squeeze, the walked buyer and the ruined clip that had never been ruined, the patient arithmetic that meant to have this hill off the bank for pennies the day after the March note came due, and Silas, who had only known pieces, sat at his own table and heard the whole of it drawn out at last, and Tabitha watched the grief in him turn, slowly, over the course of that telling, into something harder and more useful, watched a stopped man begin, painfully, to start. "I thought the world had gone against me," he said at last, very low, staring at the ledger she had opened between them, with the stolen years laid out plain in her clean column hand. "I thought it was just bad luck and bad weather and a wife in the ground and a clip nobody would buy. I never once thought it had a name." "It has a name," said Tabitha, "and a name's a thing you can push against. You cannot push against bad luck." But a man with his thumb on a scale, she closed the ledger and met his eyes across the warm lamplit table, the child asleep in the next room, the house warm around them and every door in it open at last. A man with his thumb on a scale, you can make him take his thumb off in front of the whole county. And I aim to. I have a buyer coming, if the mail held, an honest one out of Cheyenne. I have a show fleece that'll shame every false number in these books. And I have the books themselves, the proof of the cheat, 10 years of it. What I need from you, Mr. Holloway." And here she paused, because this was the hard thing, the thing a stopped man might not be able to give. "What I need is for you to stand up off this ground you have been sitting on, and come to that sale at Two Forks the second week of March and stand beside me on the floor while I do it. Not behind me, beside me. Because a thief like Crail is counting on you being too broke and too beaten to show your face. And the moment you walk onto that floor with your head up and an honest buyer at your shoulder and a fleece in your hands that makes a liar of him, that's the moment his 10 years come undone. For a long moment, Silas Holloway did not answer, and Tabitha held still and let him find his way, the way she had let him find his way to the fleece in the shed. And then the man reached across his own kitchen table, slowly, like a thing relearning a motion it had forgotten, and he laid his rough rancher's hand for one brief moment over the closed ledger and her hand resting on it. Not a liberty, only a kind of vow. And he said, "I'll come. God help me, after 3 years sitting down, I'll stand up, and I'll come, and I'll stand beside you." And he took his hand back and looked almost frightened at himself, and Tabitha looked down at the ledger and said nothing, because her heart had done a thing in her chest she had long ago told it never to do again, and she needed a moment to weigh it, the way she weighed everything, before she let herself believe what it was. But the days that followed did not run smooth, because Asa Crail, having sent his message and found it handed back unopened, did not abide resistance, and now he knew for certain that the Holloway Hill had found its feet. What he did in the gray cold first week of March was move against her quietly and against the ranch openly, both at once, the way a man does who has carried a county in his pocket so long he has forgotten that pockets can be turned out. Word came up the Burnt Fork Road by way of the freight driver that Asa Crail had stood in the Two Forks land office and let it be known. In the friendly, confiding way of a man who owns the people he is talking to, that the Holloway place was finished, that the March note would not be met, that the bank in Cheyenne had as good as foreclosed already, and that any buyer who rode up that hill to bid on Silas Holloway's clip was bidding on a dead man's wool, and would do better to wait a fortnight and buy the whole hill from Crail. Himself for half. He had even, the freight driver said, dropped the word that the new wool woman up there was a drifter with no references and no people, run off from somewhere back east, and that a man would want to count his spoons after she'd gone. He said it laughing. He said it the way he said everything, as a thing already decided. Tabitha heard it out standing in the wool room door with a fleece half skirted over her arm, and she did not flinch, and she did not curse. She only went very still the way she went still over a set of crooked weights, and then she said, to Pete, who had brought the worst of it up from the gate red-faced and furious on her behalf, "Good." Pete stared at her. "Good? He's frightened," Tabitha said. "A man that owned this county wouldn't trouble to slander a hired woman to a freight driver. He'd just wait. He's not waiting, he's talking. That means somewhere under all that gold he has felt the floor move, and he is trying to talk it back into place before the second week of March." She turned the fleece over on her arm, found the fault she was looking for, and laid it on the second pile. Let him talk. Talk's cheap, and it's the only cheap thing he's got left. We're going to bring something to that floor that money can't argue with. And then she did the thing she had been doing all along, only now she did it like a woman building a case for a court, quietly, completely, leaving nothing to chance and nothing to luck. She had already, weeks before, dug the proof out of the old buyer's tally books where Silas had stuffed them unread behind the stove, the consistent short waits, The fine blood fleeces graded down to common and paid at common, the same crabbed false hand in the column year after year, and always when she traced the buyer's paper back through the freight bills. The wool moving on at full grade and full price to a warehouse in Cheyenne that, when she finally got the name clear off a water-stained bill of lading, belonged, through 2 thin layers of other men's names, to Asa Cry. 10 years of it. The Holloway fine blood, the best wool on that whole stretch of the Burnt Fork, bought cheap as common off a grieving man, and sold dear as what it was. The difference going quietly into Crale's pocket while the Holloway note crept year by year toward the cliff. It was all there. She had it in a clean stack, the false books and the freight bills and her own plain accounting laid beside them so that any honest man could see the cheat in under a minute. But proof of an old cheat would not, by itself, pay a note due March 1st, and Tabitha knew it. Proof shamed a man. It did not buy a hill. What would buy the hill was the wool itself, sold at last for what it honestly was, and so through those last cold days before the sale she gave herself over wholly to the clip. She and Pete and the 2 hands washed the chosen fleeces in the soft snow melt water she had taught them to catch and warm. And she sorted the whole top of the Holloway clip with her grandmother's comb and her 22 years of knowing, throwing out anything with a fault, keeping only the sound, true fine blood, until she had built a clip to go to 2 forks that was fleece for fleece, the finest wool that would touch that floor, and she had built, besides, 1 single show fleece, the queen of the whole hill, a great pale cloud of fine blood off a 4-year ewe, washed and skirted and rolled with a perfection that was its own kind of argument, a fleece that would put the lie to every cheap number Crale's men had ever written against the Holloway name, a fleece a blind man could have graded fine by the feel of it alone. The night before the sale she sat up late at the kitchen table getting it ready, and Nan, who was meant to be asleep, came padding out in her nightdress and stood watching with her chin on the table edge. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Nan said. Not crying, just asking, the way the child asked everything, straight. Tabitha set down the comb. She had learned in 3 weeks that you did not lie to this child, that lying to her was the one thing that would close her face the way her father's face had closed. "There's a man," Tabitha said, "who has been stealing from your papa for a long time, since before you were big enough to remember. And tomorrow your papa and I are going to a sale in town. And we are going to show everybody what he did, and we are going to sell your wool for what it's really worth. And if it goes the way I mean it to go, then no, we're not going to lose the ranch." Nan considered this. "And if it doesn't go that way?" Tabitha looked at the child a long moment and chose the truth, because the child had earned it. "Then we'll think of the next thing," she said. "There's always a next thing, Nan. The only way a body's truly beat is when they sit down and stop thinking of the next thing. And I have never in my life run clean out of next things. And I don't aim to start tomorrow." Nan thought about that and seemed to find it solid enough to sleep on. And she climbed up into Tabitha's lap without asking and put her face against the broad, warm shoulder that had hauled a ram off a cliff. And Tabitha held her, and after a while carried her in and put her to bed, and stood a moment in the dark doorway of the child's room before she went back to the fleece. Silas was in the front room when she passed, and he had heard it, all of it, standing in the dark hall with his hand on the wall. He did not say anything. But in the morning when she came out before light, he was already up and dressed in the one good coat he owned, the coat he had not worn since the funeral 3 years gone, and he had hitched the wagon himself. And he stood beside it in the cold, with his hat in his hand and his face set like a man going to war or to church, and he said, "I told you I'd stand up. I'm standing up." And Tabitha, loading the clip in the great show fleece wrapped clean in muslin into the wagon bed, looked at the widower in his funeral coat with his back straight for the first time since she'd known him, and felt the thing in her chest do its forbidden motion again, and this time she did not have time to weigh it, so she just let it be. The sale floor at Two Forks was a long, cold barn of a building down by the rail spur, and it was full of wool growers and buyers and freight men and the merely curious, full of the breath of men and the smell of lanolin and dust, and it went. The moment Silas Holloway and his wool woman walked in with a wagon of clip behind them, very suddenly quiet, the way a room goes quiet when a thing it has been told is dead walks in on its own 2 feet. Asa Krail was there, of course, up near the buyers' tables, a big, smooth, comfortable man in a good coat with a heavy gold watch chain and the easy face of a man who has never once in his life doubted he would win. And his buyer was beside him, the same crabbed man whose false hand Tabitha had traced through 10 years of books, and Krail looked at Silas walking in with his head up, and at the broad, plain woman beside him, and Tabitha watched the smile stay on his face and go dead behind his eyes, and she knew, with the cold, sure pleasure of a woman who has read a man's weights, that Del Pruitt had been right. Krail had felt the floor move, and he had not believed it could really move, not all the way, not against him, and here it was, moving. The Holloway lots came up in their turn, and Krail's buyer did exactly what Tabitha had known he would do. What he had done for 10 years, he ran his eye over the fine blood clip and called it common in a bored, flat voice, and opened the bidding at a price that was an insult, the same cheap number that had been bleeding the hill dry for a decade, and he said it loud and easy, for the room. That's a tired clip off a tired hill, gentlemen, no shame in it, but it's common wool and common money, and 1 or 2 men who took their cues from Krail chuckled, and the cheap number sat there in the cold air waiting to win the way it always had. And Tabitha Fry stepped up to the floor table and unwrapped the muslin and laid the great pale show fleece down in front of the whole room. She did not make a speech. She had thought about making a speech and decided against it, because a speech was a thing a man could argue with, and the fleece was not. She simply opened it out across the table so the lantern light fell on it, the staple long and even and bright, the crimp tight and true all down the length of it, the whole great cloud of it sound and fine and unmistakable to every man in that barn who had ever run wool through his fingers, which was every man in that barn. And she said, in her plain, carrying voice, not loud, just clear, this came off the Holloway Hill. So did every fleece on that wagon. This man, she did not point, she only turned her head toward Krail's buyer, has graded Holloway fine blood, has common for 10 years, and paid common for it, and I have his own books here that say so, and I have the freight bills that say where the wool went after, at full grade and full price, and whose warehouse it went to. The grading's a lie, gentlemen. It always was. You can all see it's a lie. It's lying on the table in front of you. And she stepped back and let the fleece and the books do the rest, and the room, which had come to watch a dead ranch buried, leaned in instead to look at a great fine fleece and a stack of open books, and began, in a low rising rumble, to understand what it was looking at. After that it went very fast, the way these things do once the floor turns. An honest buyer, Tabitha's buyer, the one she had written to in Cheyenne, a square gray man named Aldous, who had ridden up on the speck of her letter and a sample she'd mailed, and who had been standing quiet at the back the whole while waiting for this exact moment, stepped forward and put his hands in the show fleece and graded it aloud, finest he'd handled that season, and opened the bidding for the whole Holloway clip at better than 3 times the cheap number, and meant it, and had the Cheyenne money behind him to pay it. And the other buyers, who were not fools, who had only been following Crayle's lead because Crayle's lead had always been the safe one, looked at the fleece and looked at the books and looked at Crayle's man caught flat in his 10-year lie in front of the whole county, and they began to bid in earnest against each other for the honestly graded Holloway fine blood, and the price climbed. And climbed past anything Silas Holloway had seen for his wool in the best years before his wife died, past anything he had let himself imagine through 3 years of believing the world had simply turned against him, climbed and climbed in the cold barn while the man stood frozen with his hat in his hands and his eyes filling, until it came to rest at a number that did not merely meet the March note. It buried it. It paid the note and the back interest and the freight, and left money over, real money. The first real money the Holloway Hill had made in a decade, and it did it in front of the whole county, in the broad, cold daylight of the sale floor, with the proof of the 10-year theft lying open on the table for any man to read. Asa Crayle did not stay to the end of the bidding. Somewhere in the climbing of that price he understood that the thing he had counted on for 10 years, that no one would dig, that no one would dare, that the Holloways were too small and too sad and too alone to fight, had failed him completely. And that it had failed him because of one broad-shouldered woman the town had laughed at on the depot platform 3 weeks before, and he gathered his crabbed buyer with a jerk of his head, and he went out of that barn into the cold. And he was a smaller man going out than he had been coming in, and every man on that floor watched him go, and knew it. He would not be ruined by it. Men like Crayle are rarely ruined. They only shrink, but he was done on the burnt fork. A man whose thumb has been shown to the whole county sitting on the scale does not get to keep his hand in the county's pocket. His buyer never graded another Holloway fleece, and the squeeze that had been 10 years closing on the Holloway Hill came open that afternoon on a sale floor, all at once, undone by an honest fleece and a clean column of figures and a woman who would not run out of next things. It was Del Pruitt who let out the first whoop from over by the door where he'd brought half the ranch hands in to see it, an old man's cracked holler of pure joy. And then the back of the room was full of it, the burnt fork men who had no love for Crayle and a sudden great love for the woman who'd brought him down, and somebody clapped Silas Holloway on the back hard enough to stagger him. And the town that had laughed 3 weeks gone was not laughing now, was, in fact, shouldering up to shake the hand of the big, plain wool woman, the men taking off their hats to her one after another the way Del had in the gray dawn at the empty tank, the word already running out the barn door and up the burnt fork road ahead of the wagon. The Holloway Hill had a wool woman now. And you graded her clip honest? Oh, you didn't grade it at all. They drove home in the early dark with the note money sewn in a flat packet inside Silas's funeral coat and the empty wagon light behind the team, and for a long while neither of them said anything, the cold stars coming out hard and bright over the burnt fork and the breath of the horses smoking in the lantern light. Then Silas Holloway said, low, not looking at her, his eyes on the team, 3 weeks ago I'd have signed this hill over for the price of the note and counted myself lucky to walk off it. I'd given it up. I'd given everything up. He was quiet a moment. You walked up my road with a carding comb and no references and the whole town laughing, and you would not let me give it up. You wouldn't let the ranch go, and you wouldn't let the child go shut up and lonely, and you wouldn't. His voice caught, and he made himself go on. A stopped man forcing the last of it open. You wouldn't let me go. I was the easiest thing on that hill to give up on. Even I'd given up on me. And you wouldn't. No, said Tabitha, I wouldn't. Why, Silas said, not a challenge. A man genuinely asking the thing he could not understand. You owed me nothing. I hired you for a winter to card wool. You could have taken your wage and your good name from the sale today and gone anywhere. Cheyenne, hire you in a heartbeat now. Why'd you stay and fight for a beaten man's hill? And Tabitha Fry, who had spent 22 years being the unwanted one. The one too big and too plain and too much, the one no family kept and no town claimed, looked out at the hard, bright stars over the hill she had hauled back from the edge with her own bleeding hands, and told him the truth, because he had earned the truth the way Nan earned it. Because when I dug down past the foul top of your wool that first day, she said, I found good fine blood underneath that nobody had bothered to look for. And I knew that wool. I knew it like my own face. Everybody who'd ever looked at it had graded it cheap and common and walked on, and they were wrong, and it was the finest thing on the hill, and it just needed somebody to dig down past what the neglect had done to the top of it and find what was always there underneath. She was quiet a moment. I've been graded cheap my whole life, Mr. Holloway, off a depot platform by a town in one look. I know what it is to be the fine blood that everybody calls common because they can't be troubled to dig. So when I found your wool, and then I found your child, and then I found you, 3 good things this county had graded cheap and walked on, I couldn't walk on. That's all. I couldn't walk on because I knew what you were under the top of it. I always knew. Silas Holloway pulled the team up. Right there on the dark road under the hard stars, a mile short of his own gate, he stopped the wagon, and he turned on the seat and looked at her. This big plain woman, with her bleeding, healing hands folded in her lap and the starlight on her broad, steady face. And for the first time in 3 years, the door that had been nailed shut over everything that man felt came clean off its hinges and stayed off, and he did not say a clever thing or a careful thing. He just looked at her the way a man looks at the one thing he has stopped believing he was allowed to want. And then he reached up, slow, the way he'd reached across the ledger that first night. And he tucked a loose strand of her hair, come down in the cold and the work of the day, back behind her ear, his rough, cold hand resting one moment against the side of her face. That was all. He did not kiss her. That was not the kind of man he was, nor the kind of woman she was, not on a cold road a mile from the child asleep at home. He only tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and let his hand rest there one moment in the starlight, and it was a question, the whole question, asked at last without a single word, and Tabitha Fry, who had told her heart years ago never again to do the thing it was doing now, leaned her cheek just slightly, just for a breath, into the cold, rough palm of his hand, and that was the answer, the whole answer, yes, given the same way, without a word. And then the moment was enough, was more than 2 careful, grieving people could hold any longer on a cold road. And Silas took his hand back gentle and clucked to the team, and they drove the last mile up the hill to the warm-lit house, in a silence that was no longer the silence of two strangers, but of two people who had just promised each other a life and were each privately astonished to have been given the chance. The Burnt Fork Spring came on, and the hill came back to life the way the house had. Room by room, fence line by fence line, the snow going off the south slopes, and the new grass coming green, and the 400 ewes Tabitha had carried through the killing night, dropping their lambs in the soft April weather with Tabitha and Pete and Dell out among them at all hours. And not a hand on that ranch now who would have said a word against the wool woman. Not for a wage twice what they made. The note was paid and torn up. Silas drove to Cheyenne himself and stood at the bank and watched the man cancel it and tore the canceled paper in half on the bank steps in the spring sun and put the halves in his pocket to show the hill. The Holloway clip the next shearing went down to 2 Forks honest graded and sold high, the highest on the Burnt Fork. And the shearing after that the buyers stopped waiting for 2 Forks and rode up the hill itself to bid on it standing in the wool room, the way buyers ride up to the one clip in a county that everybody knows is the true thing, and the woman they bid in front of, the woman whose grade they trusted and whose word closed the deal, was Tabitha, every time. The broad-shouldered wool woman of the Holloway Hill, and not one of them remembered any longer, or would have dared say if they did, that the town had once laughed at her on a depot platform and called her a flock with no shepherd. She married Silas Holloway in the little frame church at Burnt Fork in the green of that first summer, in a dress Nan helped her choose. And Nan stood up beside her holding the flowers with her whole face open and shining. The closed, careful child of the shut-up house gone for good, replaced by a brown, laughing girl who ran the hill barefoot and rode behind Tabitha on the gray mare and told everyone who would listen that her mother was the strongest lady in the world, which by then the whole county more or less agreed was true. And it was after the wedding, sometime in the easy gold of that first married summer, that the thing happened which Tabitha would hold longest of all the things that Hill gave her, that Nan, calling across the yard for her one ordinary evening, not thinking about it, not making a ceremony of it, simply called her Ma, the way a child calls the woman who is plainly and forever her mother, and went on with whatever she was doing, and never knew that the big woman by the wool room door had to stop and put her hand against the doorframe a moment, because the word had gone into her like a key into the one lock she had carried shut her whole life. She lived a long time on the Holloway Hill, the Fry Hill, the neighbors came to call it, half the time, which made Silas laugh, and Tabitha pretend to scold. She buried Silas, an old man 40 years on, gray and gentled and grateful to the last, and she raised Nan and Nan's children and helped raise theirs. And the fine blood flock she had dug out from under a decade of neglect became the thing that whole stretch of the Burnt Fork was known for, the wool other ranchers came to learn from, the grade other ranchers measured theirs against. And the carding comb her grandmother had given her, the one thing she'd carried 1,100 miles with no family and no references and no welcome, hung by the wool room door her whole long life, and she taught a granddaughter to use it, and that granddaughter taught another, so that the knowing in it never died. But she never forgot, and she never let the hill forget. What she had been when she came up its road, the unwanted one, the too big, too plain, no people woman a whole town had graded cheap in a single look off a depot platform. She kept that. Not out of bitterness, she had no bitterness left in her by the end, the hill had taken it all. She kept it because of what it had taught her. The one thing she'd built her whole long good life on and made sure to hand down with the come, that the world is full of fine blood graded common by people too lazy or too frightened or too cruel to dig down past the foul top of a thing and find what's truly there, full of good wool and good hills and good men and good children. And good women too big and too plain for the world's easy looking, and that the only sin that ever truly mattered was walking on past worth because it didn't announce itself, was leaving the fine thing buried because the top of it had gone dirty under hard years. She had been left buried once. She had been the fine thing graded cheap and walked past on a platform. And because one folded newspaper notice had carried her to a ruined hill where a grieving man and a lonely child and a clip full of buried fine blood had needed exactly what she was, she had never been left buried again, and she had spent the rest of her long life making sure, ewe by ewe and child by child and fleece by honest fleece, that as far as her two strong hands could reach across that hill, nothing fine was ever again graded cheap and walked past on the burnt fork. The same hands that had hauled 190-pound mountain ram up off a 40-foot cliff by one snared horn while a whole frozen ranch of men stood watching, those same hands, at the end of it all, held her own land's wool, her own hill's clip, her own true fine blood that no man living would dare call common. She had come up that road wanting only a winter's wage and a place the cold couldn't reach her. She had been chosen in the end, and she had chosen back, fully and freely, and with both her strong, open hands, the wool woman of the Holloway Hill, home at last and for good, never again the unwanted one, never again the flock without a shepherd, and never, to the end of her long and well-loved days, alone.